Let me ask you something that I think most people avoid thinking about too carefully, because honestly, it's a little bit terrifying when you actually sit with it. Do you know, like, specifically, with a real number, how much money you need to retire? Not a vague ballpark. Not a lot, or probably more than I have. An actual figure, the number that means you can stop trading your time for a paycheck and genuinely live off what you've built. Most people, if they're being honest, have absolutely no idea. And that's not a character flaw, it's just that nobody ever handed them the framework to figure it out. So they either avoid the question entirely, or they pick some enormous number out of thin air, like $1 million or 2 million, and either panic because it feels impossible, or shrug because it feels so far away it doesn't feel real. Both of those reactions, by the way, are completely understandable. And both of them are getting in the way of something that is actually a lot more solvable than most people think. My name is Mike, and I spend a probably unreasonable amount of time thinking about retirement math, financial independence, and the gap between what people assume this stuff requires and what it actually requires. And what I've come to believe after reading through the research, the frameworks, the real stories of people who've done it, is that the retirement number question has a surprisingly clean answer. It's not one size fits all, but it follows a logic that anyone can apply to their own life. And once you understand that logic, the whole thing stops feeling like a fog and starts feeling like a plan. That shift from fog to plan is genuinely one of the most powerful things that can happen in your financial life. So let's build it together. The place almost every serious conversation about retirement math starts is something called the 4% rule. And I want to explain this properly because it gets thrown around a lot without enough context, and the context is what makes it actually useful. The 4% rule comes from a study, the Trinity study if you want to look it up, that analyzed historical market data across different retirement periods and asked one simple question. If a retiree withdraws 4% of their portfolio in the first year of retirement and then adjusts that amount for inflation each subsequent year, how often does the portfolio survive a 30-year retirement without running out of money? The answer, across the historical data, was roughly 95% of the time. Not 100, but 95. Across 30 years, across market crashes, recessions, and everything the last century threw at investors. That's a remarkably strong number. What this means practically is this. If you can live on 4% of your portfolio per year, you have, historically speaking, almost always been fine. So the question of how much you need to retire becomes a simple math problem. You figure out your annual expenses in retirement, multiply by 25, and that's your number. That's it. That's the framework. If you need $40,000 a year to live comfortably, you need $1 million saved and invested. If you need $60,000, you need $1.5 million. If you need $80,000, $2 million. The number isn't arbitrary anymore. It's directly tied to your actual life, your actual spending, your actual definition of enough. And that specificity changes everything. Because now you're not chasing some vague mountain in the distance, you're solving a real equation with real variables that you actually control. I remember the first time this framework genuinely clicked for me. And I mean clicked in the way where you feel it, not just understand it intellectually. I'd been vaguely anxious about retirement for years in that low-grade background way that a lot of people carry without really examining it. I knew I should be saving more. I knew it mattered, but the goal felt shapeless, which made it feel impossible, which made it easy to keep deferring. And then someone walked me through exactly this math, take your spending, multiply by 25, and suddenly I had a number. A specific, real, calculable number. And I remember sitting with it and thinking, okay, this is the problem I'm solving. Not save as much as possible forever. This specific number. And something genuinely shifted. The anxiety didn't disappear, but it got organized. It turned from a fog into a target. And a target, even a challenging one, is something your brain can actually work with. Now, I want to be honest about the limitations here because I think intellectual honesty is important and people deserve the full picture, not just the comfortable version. The 4% rule is based on historical data, and history is not a guarantee. If you retire into a particularly bad market sequence, what researchers call sequence of returns risk, or if you live significantly longer than 30 years, there are scenarios where 4% becomes a little aggressive. Some financial planners suggest 3.5% for longer retirements, which translates to a multiply by 29 rather than multiply by 25. It's a more conservative target. But it's also not dramatically different in the grand scheme. The underlying principle holds. Your spending determines your number determines your target, and your savings rate determines how fast you get there. And here's the thing. Even if the 4% rule turns out to be slightly optimistic for your specific situation, understanding it gets you 90% of the way to a real plan. A rough map is infinitely more useful than no map at all. And let's talk about spending for a second, because I think this is where a lot of people get stuck in a way they don't expect. Most people, when they imagine retirement, imagine spending roughly what they spend now. And that assumption is worth questioning, because it might be too high and it might be too low depending on your situation. On the too high side, when you retire, you stop commuting. You stop needing work clothes. You stop eating expensive lunches near the office. You stop contributing to retirement accounts, because you're now drawing from them. A bunch of the costs that are currently embedded in your life because of work simply disappear. Many retirees find they spend meaningfully less than they did while working, not because they're depriving themselves, but because the structure of their expenses genuinely changes. On the too low side, healthcare. This one is real and important. Before you're eligible for government health programs, you're responsible for your own healthcare costs, which can be significant and should be budgeted for carefully. Travel might also go up in early retirement when you have the energy and freedom to use it. So the exercise of actually projecting your retirement spending, not guessing, but genuinely walking through your expected categories, is one of the most valuable things you can do. Because it directly determines your number, and your number directly determines everything else. Here's something that I think gets overlooked in most retirement conversations, and it genuinely matters. You probably already have income sources in retirement that reduce the amount your portfolio needs to cover. Depending on where you live, there are government pension programs, Social Security in the United States, for example, that will pay you a monthly amount in retirement based on your earnings history. That amount, multiplied by 12, is income that comes in every year without touching your portfolio at all. Which means your portfolio only needs to cover the gap between your total expenses and your guaranteed income sources. If you need $60,000 a year and you'll receive $20,000 a year from a government pension, your portfolio only needs to generate $40,000, which means you need $1 million, not $1.5 million. That's a meaningful difference. The math changes significantly when you account for every income stream you'll actually have, and most people either forget about these sources or dramatically underestimate them. Other income sources worth thinking about: if you own property, rental income is another one. If you have a pension from an employer, that counts. Any part-time work or passion project income in early retirement counts. The point is that the 4% rule applies to the portion of your spending your portfolio needs to cover, not necessarily your total spending. Map all your income sources first, find the gap, then size your portfolio to fill the gap. That's the cleaner way to think about it. And honestly, when most people do this exercise properly, when they actually list out every income source they'll realistically have, their target number shrinks considerably from whatever they had floating around in their head. Which is usually a relief. The mountain was always smaller than it looked from a distance. Now let's talk about the timeline, because I think this is where the rubber actually meets the road for most people. How long will it take to get there? And the honest answer is it depends almost entirely on one number, which is your savings rate. Not your income, not your job title, not whether you have a finance degree or understand the stock market in any sophisticated way, just what percentage of what you earn are you actually setting aside and investing? Because the math of savings rate and time to retirement is one of the most clarifying things in all of personal finance. Someone saving 10% of their income in normal market conditions is looking at roughly 40 to 45 years to reach financial independence. Someone saving 20%, around 30 to 35 years. Someone saving 30%, around 25 years. Someone saving 50%, and yes, some people actually do this somewhere around 15 to 17 years from the date they start, regardless of income level. The savings rate is the lever. Pull it harder, retire sooner. It really is that direct. What makes this so powerful and so different from how most people think about retirement is that it completely removes income from the center of the conversation. You don't need to earn more to retire earlier. You need to save more of what you already earn. Obviously, higher income makes it easier to save a higher percentage while still living comfortably. But the mechanism is the savings rate, not the salary. A person earning $50,000 a year and saving 30% of it will reach financial independence before a person earning $150,000 a year and saving 5%. That's not an exaggeration. That's just arithmetic. And once you really internalize that, you stop waiting for the next raise to start taking retirement seriously, because you realize the raise was never the key variable to begin with. I think one of the most motivating things you can do for your future self right now is to calculate your own number. Not approximately. Actually. Take your expected annual spending in retirement, be honest, be realistic, and multiply it by 25. Write it down. Then figure out what you currently have saved and invested. The gap between those two numbers is the distance you need to travel. And then figure out, given your current savings rate and expected investment returns, roughly when you'd close that gap. There are free online calculators that do this math in about 30 seconds. Most people who do this exercise are either more on track than they feared, or they discover a specific gap they can actually do something about, instead of living with a vague background anxiety that never resolves because they never looked at it clearly. And I want to say something about that vague anxiety specifically, because I think it does real damage that goes beyond just feeling bad. When retirement feels like this enormous, undefined looming thing, the brain's natural response is to either obsess over it unproductively or avoid it entirely. Neither of those moves your situation forward. What actually moves it forward is specificity, a number, a timeline, a savings rate with a purpose attached to it. Once you have those things, once the fog becomes a map, the emotional relationship with your own finances changes in a meaningful way. You stop feeling like a passenger in your own financial life and start feeling like you're actually driving somewhere on purpose. That shift, unglamorous as it sounds, is one of the most practically useful things that can happen to you. And here's what I want to say about the number you calculate, whatever it is. It's not a verdict. It's a starting point. If the math says you're on track to retire at 68 and you wanted 62, that gap tells you exactly what needs to change. Increase the savings rate. Reduce projected expenses. Plan to work part-time for a few years rather than fully stopping. Pick up an income-producing asset. Any one of those moves shifts the timeline. You have more variables in your control than the number makes it seem. The math isn't the enemy. The math is actually the thing that gives you clarity. And clarity, even when it's uncomfortable, is always more useful than the comfortable fog of not looking. One more thing I want to touch on, and this is the piece most retirement conversations skip entirely: the psychology of actually stopping. Of waking up one day and genuinely not needing to work for money anymore. Because it turns out that for a lot of people, this transition is harder emotionally than financially. Identity gets wrapped up in work. Structure disappears. The sense of purpose that came from showing up somewhere and contributing something needs to be rebuilt from scratch. I bring this up not to be a buzzkill, but because I think planning for what retirement looks like, not just what it costs, is as important as the math. The happiest retirees I've read about and spoken to aren't the ones with the most money. They're the ones who retired towards something: a project, a community, a creative pursuit, a way of spending time that feels meaningful. The financial number gets you the freedom. What you do with that freedom is a whole other question, and it's worth thinking about now rather than discovering it's a problem after you've already stopped working. There's actually a growing body of research on this, on why some people thrive in retirement and others quietly fall apart within a year or two. And the through line across most of it is purpose. Not luxury, not leisure, purpose. The people who do best are the ones who had something they were genuinely moving toward, not just something they were escaping. And I think that's worth sitting with, especially if retirement feels like a vague future destination you haven't thought much about beyond the financial piece. What would your days look like? What would get you out of bed in the morning when nothing is requiring you to? That question deserves as much attention as the savings rate question. Both of them are part of the same plan. So let's land this. The question of how much you need to retire is not a mystery. It's a math problem with a clear framework. Figure out your annual spending in retirement. Subtract any guaranteed income you'll receive. Multiply the remaining gap by 25. That's your number. Build a savings rate that gets you there on your preferred timeline. Use tax-advantaged accounts to protect as much of the compounding as possible and account for healthcare costs, inflation, and a retirement that might last longer than you expect by building in a small buffer, either a slightly lower withdrawal rate or a slightly larger target. None of this is simple to execute, but it is simple to understand. And understanding it, having a real number attached to a real plan, changes the entire emotional texture of your financial life. You stop feeling like you're running toward a horizon that never gets closer. You start feeling like you're solving a problem that has an actual solution. And that feeling, honestly, is one of the most powerful motivators that exists, because progress you can see creates momentum. And momentum in personal finance is almost everything. I also want to say one final thing about flexibility, because I think rigid thinking about retirement is its own kind of trap. The framework we've talked about today, the 4% rule, the multiply by 25, the savings rate math, is a set of tools, not a fixed sentence. Your number will change as your life changes. Your spending will evolve. Your income sources will shift. Your definition of what retirement even means might look completely different at 50 than it does at 30. That's okay. Actually, that's good. It means you're a real person, living a real life, and not a spreadsheet. The goal isn't to lock in a perfect plan today and execute it robotically for 30 years. The goal is to understand the levers, check in on them regularly, adjust when life requires it, and keep moving in the right general direction. That's it. That's the whole job. And the people who do that consistently, not perfectly, just consistently, are the ones who end up with the freedom to choose how they spend their time. Which is ultimately what this entire conversation has been about. You've got the framework now. The next step is to actually sit down, do the math for your own life, and let the number, whatever it is, tell you what to do next. It will. Numbers always do, if you're willing to look at them. And if the number feels big or the timeline feels long, just remember, every month you engage with this seriously is a month that's working for you. The math compounds, the clarity compounds, even the habit of paying attention compounds. None of it is wasted. And if this kind of conversation is the thing that helps you actually look, if it made retirement feel less like a distant abstract fear and more like a real, solvable problem, then I'd love to have you stick around. Consider subscribing. This is what I do here. Honest, clear, no-nonsense conversations about money, financial independence, and how to actually build a life you don't need to escape from. No hype, no shortcuts, just the real stuff laid out as plainly as I can manage. There's a lot more coming. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.